The basement smelled of iodine, old blood, and damp concrete. Sophie Novak's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she wrapped clean bandages around the wounded man's shoulder. The bullet had gone through cleanly, missing bone and major vessels. He was lucky. Most who came through her makeshift hospital were not. "Stay still," she whispered in Polish, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of German trucks patrolling the streets above. The man, no older than 19, bit down on the leather strap between his teeth and nodded. Sweat poured down his pale face despite the November cold that seeped through every crack in the walls. Sophie finished the dressing and stepped back, wiping her hands on her already stained apron. The underground hospital, if it could be called that, consisted of 3 connected cellars beneath what had once been a bakery in Warsaw's Wola district. Now the bakery above was a burned shell, deliberately left in ruins to avoid suspicion. No German patrol would waste time searching a destroyed building when there were so many others to ransack. 6 beds lined the walls, all occupied. 2 resistance fighters with gunshot wounds. 1 woman crushed in a building collapse during the last bombardment. An elderly man with pneumonia who would likely not survive another week, and 2 children suffering from typhus. The children broke Sophie's heart, most of all. They lay silent and hollow-eyed, too weak even to cry. She moved to check on them, placing a cool cloth on the forehead of the younger one, a girl of perhaps 7 whose name was Cassia. The child's breathing was shallow and rapid. Sophie had almost no medicine left. The morphine was gone entirely, the sulfur drugs nearly exhausted, and even basic bandages were running dangerously low. "How is she?" The voice came from the shadows near the entrance. Maria, Sophie's only assistant, emerged carrying a bucket of water they had hauled from a hidden well 2 streets away. Maria was younger than Sophie, barely 23, but her eyes held the exhaustion of someone who had lived through centuries of suffering rather than mere years. "Not good," Sophie replied honestly. "Without proper antibiotics, I don't know if she'll make it through the night." Maria set down the bucket with a heavy thud. "John is upstairs. He says he needs to speak with you, says it's urgent." Sophie felt her stomach tighten. Jan was one of the senior members of the resistance network, a hardened fighter who rarely visited the hospital unless something was seriously wrong. She glanced once more at Cassia, then climbed the rickety wooden stairs that led to the ground floor of the ruined bakery. Jan stood among the rubble, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light filtering through the collapsed roof. He was a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, his face carved from years of fighting an enemy that seemed invincible. When he turned to face Sophie, she saw the tension in his eyes. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "The Gestapo has increased patrols in this sector. They're conducting house-to-house searches 3 blocks from here. Someone talked, or they found something. Either way, they're getting closer." Sophie's hands clenched at her sides. "How long do we have?" "A day. Maybe 2 if we're lucky." Jan paused, his jaw working as if he were chewing on words he did not want to say. "You need to evacuate the hospital. Move everyone to the safe house on Clodna Street." "Move them?" Sophie's voice rose slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "Jan, half of them can't walk. The children have typhus. Moving them could kill them just as surely as the Germans. And staying here will definitely kill them." Jan shot back, "along with you and Maria. The Gestapo doesn't take prisoners from underground hospitals, Sophie. You know what they do." She did know. She had heard the stories, seen the photographs pass through the resistance network. Doctors and nurses shot on sight, patients murdered in their beds, entire buildings burned to the ground with everyone inside. The Germans had no mercy for those who aided the Polish resistance. "I need more time," Sophie said, her mind racing through impossible calculations. "Give me 3 days. I can stabilize the children, prepare the others for transport." "You don't have 3 days." "Then 2. Please, Jan." He studied her face for a long moment, then exhaled sharply through his nose. "I'll do what I can to slow them down. But Sophie, if you hear German voices on this street, you run. Don't try to be a hero. Your medical skills are worth more to the resistance than any individual patient. Do you understand?" Sophie wanted to argue, to tell him that she could not simply abandon the people who trusted her with their lives. But she also knew Jan was right. If she died here, who would treat the next wave of wounded? Who would keep the underground hospital network running? I understand, she whispered. Jan nodded curtly and disappeared into the ruins without another word, his footsteps silent despite the debris scattered everywhere. Sophie stood alone in the skeletal remains of the bakery, surrounded by the ghosts of what this place had once been. She could almost smell the bread baking, hear the laughter of customers, see the baker's children playing in the street outside. Now there was only ash and death and the constant fear that pressed down like a physical weight. She descended back into the basement where Maria was changing the dressing on the elderly man's bed sores. The old man, whose name was Piotr, had been a professor of literature at the university before the war. Now he was dying slowly in a dark hole beneath the earth, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. We may need to move, Sophie told Maria quietly, not wanting to alarm the patients. Soon. Maria's hands paused for just a moment, then continued their work. How soon? Jan says a day or two. Then we should start preparing now. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, organizing what little supplies they had, making lists of who could walk and who would need to be carried, calculating routes through the sewers and destroyed buildings that might allow them to move undetected. It was a logistical nightmare with no good solutions. As darkness fell completely, Sophie allowed herself a brief rest. She sat on an overturned crate in the corner, her back against the cold wall, and closed her eyes. Exhaustion pulled at her like a riptide, threatening to drag her under. She had not slept more than a few hours in the past 3 days, and the constant stress was grinding her down to nothing. The sound of footsteps on the stairs brought her instantly alert. Her hand moved instinctively to the small pistol she kept hidden in her apron pocket. But it was only Tomasz, another resistance fighter who sometimes brought them supplies. Except tonight, Tomasz was not alone. Behind him came a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, all wearing the yellow stars that marked them as Jews. They were thin to the point of starvation, their clothes hanging off their frames like shrouds. The woman clutched an infant to her chest, wrapped in rags that had once been a blanket. Sophie's heart sank even as she rose to her feet. They came from the ghetto, Tomasz said, his voice low and urgent. Got out through a tunnel before the last deportation. They have nowhere else to go, Sophie. Nowhere. She looked at the family, saw the desperate hope in their eyes warring with the absolute terror of their situation. The man held his 2 older children close, a boy and a girl, who could not have been more than 5 and 7 years old. They stared at Sophie with the same hollow expression as Kasia, the typhus patient. The baby, Sophie said, moving closer. Is she sick? The mother shook her head frantically. No, just hungry. We had no food for 3 days. Please, we need only a place to hide for a few days. Then we go. We not stay long. Her Polish was broken, heavily accented. The family was probably from one of the Eastern territories, swept up in the Nazi machinery of death and deposited in the Warsaw ghetto to await their turn for the trains to Treblinka. Sophie looked at Tomasz. You know the situation. Jan was just here. The Gestapo is searching this sector. If they find Jews hiding here... I know, Tomasz interrupted. But Sophie, look at Samayit. Them. The baby won't survive another night in the sewers. The children are already sick. You're a doctor. You took an oath. I'm a nurse, Sophie corrected automatically, though the distinction seemed absurd given everything else. She had performed surgeries that would have terrified most doctors, made life and death decisions every single day, kept people alive through sheer force of will and whatever scraps of medicine she could scavenge. But this was different. This was not just treating wounded resistance fighters who knew the risk they were taking. This was harboring Jews, which carried an automatic death sentence not just for her, but for everyone in the building, including her patients who could not defend themselves or run away. The moral calculus was impossible. Save these 5 people and risk the 6 already in her care. Turn them away and condemn them to certain death in the streets? There's a safe house, she said finally. Tomasz, you know the one I mean. The widow Kowalski on Marszałkowska Street. She has a false wall in her cellar. Take them there. Tomasz shook his head. The Kowalski house was raided yesterday. The widow is dead. They found the hiding space and shot everyone inside, then burned the building. The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. She had known Mrs. Kowalski, a fierce old woman who had lost 3 sons in the September campaign of 1939 and dedicated what remained of her life to fighting the Germans in any way she could. Now she was gone. Just another name on an endless list of the dead. Then take them to... Sophie, Tomasz interrupted gently. There is nowhere else. Every safe house in this district is either full or compromised. You're the only option. She wanted to scream at him, to curse him for putting this impossible choice on her shoulders. But Tomasz was right, and they both knew it. She was the only option, which meant there was really no choice at all. 3 days, she said, her voice harder than she felt. You hide here for 3 days while I arrange transport out of the city. After that, you must go. I have sick patients who cannot be moved easily, and we're already preparing to evacuate. Do you understand? The father nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his gaunt face. Yes, 3 days. Thank you. God bless you. Sophie did not feel blessed. She felt trapped, cornered by circumstances beyond her control and moral obligations that pulled in opposite directions. But she pushed those feelings down into the locked box in her mind, where she kept all the unbearable emotions, and focused on the practical matters at hand. Maria, she called out, we have new guests. They'll need water and whatever food we can spare. Maria emerged from behind a curtain that separated the main ward from their tiny supply area. Her eyes widened when she saw the Jewish family, but to her credit, she said nothing. She simply nodded and went to fetch what little food they had. Sophie showed the family to a corner of the cellar that was slightly less damp than the rest, separated from the main ward by some old sheets hung from the ceiling. It was not much, barely enough space for all 5 of them to lie down, but it would have to suffice. The mother, whose name was Rachel, nursed the infant while Sophie examined the 2 older children. Both showed early signs of malnutrition and dehydration, but nothing immediately life-threatening. The boy, David, had a nasty cough that worried Sophie. Pneumonia in these conditions could turn fatal within days. Keep them warm, she instructed Rachel, as warm as possible, and make sure they drink all the water Maria brings. Small sips if their stomachs can't handle more. You are a good person, Rachel said softly, reaching out to touch Sophie's hand. God will remember. Sophie pulled her hand back gently. God has forgotten Poland, she said, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her voice. These people had suffered far more than she could imagine. The ghetto was hell on earth, a place where people starved and died in the streets while German soldiers watched with indifference or amusement. She left the family and returned to her other patients. The young resistance fighter with the shoulder wound was sleeping fitfully, his forehead hot with the beginning of a fever. She had known this would happen. Even clean gunshot wounds often became infected without proper antibiotics. She administered the last of their precious penicillin, knowing it might not be enough, but unable to do more. Then she checked on Kasia and her brother, both still burning with typhus. The girl's breathing had worsened, becoming more labored and irregular. Sophie, Maria whispered, appearing at her elbow. We need to talk. They moved to the farthest corner of the basement, as far from both the patients and the Jewish family as possible. This is dangerous, Maria said without preamble. More dangerous than anything we've done before. If the Gestapo comes... I know, Sophie cut her off. But what was I supposed to do? Send them back into the street to die? Maybe, Maria said. And there was no judgment in her voice, only exhausted pragmatism. Maybe that would have been kinder than giving them false hope. 3 days, Sophie. You know as well as I do that we can't move them in 3 days. We can barely move our own patients. Then we'll find a way to do both. There is no way. We don't have the resources, the manpower, or the time. Maria paused, her voice dropping even lower. And if the Germans find Jews hiding here, they won't just shoot us. They'll torture us. First, trying to find out who else is involved in the network. They'll destroy everything we've built. Sophie knew Maria was right. The logical, rational part of her brain understood that harboring the Jewish family put everyone at risk. But the other part of her, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be human rather than just a survivor, could not accept turning them away. I couldn't do it, she said simply. I couldn't look into that mother's eyes and condemn her children to death. Could you? Maria was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head. No, I suppose I couldn't either. But Sophie, we need a real plan, not just hope and prayer. They spent the next hour strategizing, speaking in whispers as the patients slept around them. The problem was multifaceted and seemed to have no good solution. Moving 10 people, 5 of whom were critically ill or injured, through German-controlled streets was next to impossible. The sewers were one option, but they were flooded from recent rains and patrolled by German soldiers who had learned that resistance fighters used them for transportation. The alternative was to split up, move the patients who could walk first, establish them in the safe house on Klodna Street, then return for the others. But that meant multiple trips through dangerous territory, multiplying the chances of being caught. And what about the Jewish family? They could not go to the resistance safe house. The people there were brave, but they were not equipped or prepared to hide Jews. The risk was too great, the consequences too severe. We need to contact Father Novak, Sophie said finally. The church on Jelazna Street. He has connections to the Council for Aid to Jews. If anyone can help us smuggle them out of the city, it's him. Maria nodded slowly. I'll go at first light, but Sophie, even if Father Novak agrees to help, it will take time to arrange false papers, find a safe route out of Warsaw. We're talking about at least a week, maybe more. A week. 7 days of hiding a Jewish family in an underground hospital that was already compromised, already on the Gestapo's radar. 7 days of waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, the shouted commands in German, the gunfire. Then we buy ourselves a week, Sophie said with more confidence than she felt. We keep our heads down, we stay quiet, and we pray that the Germans look somewhere else first. It was a terrible plan, full of holes and dependent entirely on luck. But it was the only plan they had. The night passed slowly, marked by the groans of the wounded and the occasional distant sound of artillery fire from the Eastern Front. The war was turning against Germany. Everyone knew that now. The Russians were pushing west, grinding down the Wehrmacht through sheer numbers and winter cold. But that offered little comfort to the people trapped in occupied Warsaw. If anything, the Germans were becoming more brutal as they sensed their empire crumbling, lashing out with increased savagery at anyone they deemed enemies of the Reich. Sophie dozed fitfully in her corner, jerking awake at every small sound. In her dreams, she was back in the hospital where she had trained before the war, back when medicine was about healing rather than just postponing death. She saw her fiancé, Carol, standing in the corridor in his white doctor's coat, smiling at her the way he had the day they got engaged. Then the dream shifted, and Carol was lying in the street, his body broken and bleeding, killed in the first days of the uprising. She had not been able to save him. She had not even been able to reach him before he died. She woke with tears on her face and the bitter taste of grief in her mouth. Morning came with no sunlight penetrating the underground shelter. Time was marked only by Maria's departure and return, bringing news that Father Novak would help but needed 3 days to make arrangements. 3 days that Sophie had already promised to the family. The situation felt like walking a tight rope stretched over an abyss, any moment expecting to fall. On the second day, the young resistance fighter with the shoulder wound took a turn for the worse. His fever spiked dangerously high, and the wound began to show signs of serious infection despite the antibiotics. Sophie did what she could, applying fresh dressings and keeping him hydrated, but without stronger medicine, there was little hope. He died just before midnight, quietly slipping away in his sleep. They wrapped his body in a sheet and carried it upstairs to be collected by the resistance network. Someone would make sure he received a proper burial, his name added to the growing list of martyrs. Sophie felt the death like a personal failure, though she knew there was nothing more she could have done. Every death felt that way now, as if she were not trying hard enough, not smart enough, not skilled enough to save them all. On the third day, Jan returned with grim news. The Germans raided a safe house 2 blocks from here last night, he reported, his face grave. They found resistance fighters and executed them on the spot. The patrols are intensifying. You need to evacuate now, Sophie. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours, now. Sophie felt her world tilting. I can't. The children with typhus can't be moved. The Jewish family. Damn the Jewish family! Jan exploded, then immediately lowered his voice. Sophie, I understand what you're trying to do. I admire it, truly, but you're risking the entire network for 5 people. 5 people who are already doomed. The Jews in Warsaw are all going to die eventually. You know that. We all know that. But the resistance can still make a difference. Your skills can still save lives. Don't throw that away for a gesture that changes nothing. The words were brutal, delivered without mercy, but they were also, in their own terrible way, logical. The mathematics of survival in occupied Poland were harsh and unforgiving. Sometimes saving anyone meant sacrificing someone else. "Get out," Sophie said quietly. "Leave my hospital." "Sophie, I said get out!" Her voice rose to a shout before she could stop herself. Several patients stirred, and she heard Rachel's frightened gasp from behind the curtain. "This is my hospital. These are my patients, and I make the decisions here. If you want to help, then help. If not, then leave and let me do my job." Jan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "You're going to get everyone killed. You know that, don't you? Then I'll die with them," Sophie replied. "Now go." He went, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. When he was gone, Sophie sagged against the wall, all the strength draining out of her. Maria appeared at her side, saying nothing, just standing there in silent support. "Was I wrong?" Sophie whispered. "I don't know," Maria answered honestly. "Maybe there is no right answer anymore. Maybe there's just what we can live with and what we can't." That afternoon, Father Novak sent word through his network. He had arranged false papers for the Jewish family and found a farmer willing to hide them on his land outside the city. But they needed to move immediately. The window of opportunity was closing fast. Sophie gathered Rachel and her husband, whose name was Mordecai, and explained the situation. They would leave after nightfall, guided by one of Father Novak's trusted assistants. The journey would be dangerous, requiring them to pass through German checkpoints using false identity papers that claimed they were a Polish Catholic family relocating to the countryside. "The children must stay absolutely silent," Sophie warned. "If they cry or speak Yiddish at the checkpoint, everyone will be shot. Do you understand? Not arrested. Shot, right there on the road." Rachel's face went white, but she nodded. "They will be silent. I promise." Sophie spent the remaining hours before their departure preparing the family as best she could. She cleaned their clothes, found them slightly better shoes, coached them on their false identities and backstories. Mordecai was now Piotr Kowalczyk, a carpenter from Praga. Rachel was Zofia, his wife. The children were Janek, Ania, and baby Christina. She made them practice saying their false names over and over until they responded naturally. She taught them Catholic prayers that German soldiers might demand they recite. She did everything she could to increase their chances of survival from near zero to something slightly higher. As darkness fell, Father Novak's assistant arrived. He was a thin young man with nervous eyes, but he moved with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "We have to leave now," he said. "The patrol schedule shifts in 20 minutes. That's our window." Sophie watched as the family gathered their few possessions. Rachel held the baby close, whispering to her in Yiddish, telling her to be quiet, to be good, to live. The older children clutched their parents' hands, their eyes wide with fear and hope in equal measure. Mordecai approached Sophie one last time. He took her hand in both of his grip firm despite his weakness. "I have nothing to give you," he said in his heavily accented Polish. "No money, no jewels. The Germans took everything, but I give you this." He pressed something small into her palm. When she looked down, she saw it was a tiny silver pendant shaped like the Star of David. "My grandmother gave this to my mother. My mother gave it to me. Now I give it to you, so you remember. Someone lived, someone survived, because of you." Sophie's vision blurred with tears. She wanted to tell him not to thank her, that she had done nothing special, that anyone would have done the same, but she knew that was a lie. Most people would not have taken the risk. Most people were too afraid, too focused on their own survival. "Go," she whispered. "Go and live. Live for all of us who can't." They left through the tunnel that connected the basements, emerging 2 buildings away into the dark Warsaw night. Sophie watched from a crack in the rubble until they disappeared into the shadows. Then she returned to her patients, to Maria, to the endless work of keeping people alive one more day. But even as she changed bandages and administered medicine and whispered words of comfort, her mind was on that family walking through the darkness. She imagined them at the checkpoint, the German soldier looking at their papers with suspicious eyes. She imagined Rachel holding her breath, the baby miraculously staying silent, the children remembering their false names and Catholic prayers. She imagined them making it through, reaching the farm, finding safety, surviving. She had to imagine it, had to believe it was possible. Because if she stopped believing that any of this mattered, that any life could be saved from the machinery of death that had consumed Poland, then she would have no reason to keep going. The night stretched on, endless and dark. Somewhere above them, the city lay broken and bleeding. Somewhere in the distance, the war ground on, consuming lives by the millions. And somewhere, she hoped, a family walked towards safety carrying her small act of defiance against all the cruelty of the world. 3 days later, Jan returned. His face was softer this time, less angry. "The family made it," he said without preamble. "Father Novak received word this morning. They're safe on the farm. The children are alive." Sophie felt something break loose in her chest, some tight knot of tension that had been strangling her for days. She sat down hard on an overturned crate, suddenly unable to stand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me." Jan nodded. "You were right. I was wrong. Sometimes," he paused, searching for words. "Sometimes we have to be more than just soldiers. Sometimes we have to remember we're human." After he left, Sophie allowed herself a moment of weakness. She put her face in her hands and wept silently, her shoulders shaking. Maria found her that way and held her without speaking, just offering the comfort of another human presence in the darkness. When the tears stopped, Sophie wiped her eyes and stood up. There was still patients to care for, still work to be done. Kasia's fever had broken during the night. She would survive. The elderly professor had died peacefully in his sleep, finally free from suffering. New wounded would arrive tomorrow or the next day, and she would treat them as she always did. The hospital would eventually be discovered. She knew that. The Gestapo would come, and when they did, she would likely die. But until that moment arrived, she would keep working. She would keep saving lives. She would keep being human in a world that had forgotten what humanity meant. Because in the end, that was all anyone could do. Keep going. Keep fighting. Keep believing that even the smallest act of kindness mattered in the face of infinite cruelty. Sophie Novak returned to her patients, her hands steady, her heart both broken and whole. And in a dark cellar beneath the ruins of Warsaw, she continued her quiet war against death itself.